The Great Famine in Ireland was the biggest event in the nation's history. No other event had ever such a profound effect on the country. Over the next several decades, the impact of the famine led to the 1916 Rising, the War of Independence, and contributed to the partition of the country, which still affects Ireland to the present day. It also had a huge impact on immigration to America and elsewhere. So the famine changed the course of Irish history and Ireland's relationship with both Great Britain and the United States. Between 1845 and 52, over 1 million Irish people died of hunger and disease, and another million emigrated. So in that 7-year period, Ireland lost about a quarter of its population. During the famine, we had thousands of tons of food being exported from the country, and as people got to know this, they came to realise that the British government was totally unsuitable to be run in Ireland. And as people thought about that in the following decades, people like James Stephens set up the Fenian movement. And that led to a lot of people like John Devoy in America and Roger Casement, Pádraig Pearse, De Valera. These people decided that they wanted to get rid of British influence in Ireland. On the other hand, you had Michael Davitt, who came back from England in the 1860s, and he started up the Land League, which boycotted the landlord system. Eventually, that forced the British to sell the land to Irish farmers, or forced the landlords to do so. So these were the developments as a result of the famine. Thank you. On the political front, Charles Stewart Parnell and the Irish Parliamentary Party demanded Home Rule for Ireland. Home Rule is basically a term used to describe a limited form of self-government for Ireland within the British Empire. These demands were resisted for decades by the British government, who feared that even a limited form of government for Ireland could lead to the collapse of the entire empire, which of course eventually it did. Eventually, when the First World War broke out, Irish Republicans saw it as an opportunity to get more than home rule. They were inspired by stories and folk memories of the famine and were determined to completely break free from British rule. Such stories about the famine were truly horrific. Corpses were strewn along the roads of Ireland. Some counties lost as many as 45 or 50,000 of their population. Sometimes entire villages were wiped out. So Republicans and volunteers such as Pádraig Pearse and Eamon de Valera, Roger Casement, resolved to ensure that such an event would never happen again. That meant demanding a complete separation from Britain and an end to British rule in Ireland. Now to take a more detailed look at the famine itself. By November 1845, letters were being sent to the British government from priests and bishops from all over the country. They were deeply concerned about the failure of the potato crop. The situation was truly alarming. Poorer farmers were completely dependent on potatoes. Almost half the farmers had less than 5 acres of land. Tens of thousands lived on less than 1 acre of land. So these people were completely dependent on potatoes and often eat them 3 times a day. So by November 1845, an urgent meeting was held in the Mansion House in Dublin. It was headed by Daniel O'Connell and Henry Grattan, 2 former politicians. They recommended an instant ban on the export of grain and that whisky distilleries stop being supplied with wheat and oats. But such recommendations, unfortunately, were completely ignored by the government and no effective action was taken. So by March 1946, the government began a public works programme to build roads, bridges and harbours, but people were only paid 8p a day, and this was not nearly enough to buy alternative foodstuffs. So as the famine progressed over the first 2 years, from 1845 to 47, it was actually getting worse all the time. 1847 was the worst year, that's known as Black 47. That year, 600,000 Irish people died, and Robert Peel, the Prime Minister, put Sir Charles Trevelyan in charge of the Irish situation. But he had really no clue what he was doing. And at one stage he wrote to the Prime Minister saying that the real problem was not the famine itself, but the moral character of the Irish people. And basically the situation went from bad to worse over the next couple of years. And it convinced most Irish people that it was time to ensure that the British government were cleared out of the country. Indeed, right in the middle of the famine in 1848, the first signs of resistance were beginning to emerge. That year, a rebellion took place in County Limerick. A Protestant landlord, William Smith O'Brien, led a rebellion in which They clashed with police and several people were killed and injured. O'Brien's gesture was truly heroic given that everyone was basically half starved at the time. The country was on its knees. He's remembered today as a great inspirational figure of Irish nationalism, and this monument was later erected in O'Connell Street, Dublin, in his memory. The famine also had a huge effect on Irish farming in terms of the farmers no longer subdivided their holdings among their sons. Instead of that, the farm was left to one child, and the rest of the family either immigrated or went to the bigger towns or to Dublin. This led to a continuous reduction of the population, however, and over the next 40 years, another 2 million people either left the country, and the population as a result was halved to 4 million by the turn of the century in 1900. However, in the new century, a new political dynamic developed. The failure of John Redmond and his parliamentary party to achieve Home Rule led to the formation of the Irish Volunteers in 1913. But Home Rule for Ireland was eventually achieved in 1914, but it was decided to postpone it until after the war. John Redmond, as leader of Irish nationalism, appealed to the volunteers to support the British war effort. Indeed, most of them did, about 60,000 did. However, a substantial minority, about 10,000 men, refused to do so. They were influenced by the old Fenian belief that England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. That minority became the driving force of Irish nationalism in the years ahead and eventually led to the Declaration of Independence in the Easter Rising of 1916. In the aftermath of the Rising, 14 of the leaders of the volunteers and the IRB were executed. However, this made the situation worse. Hundreds more prisoners were transferred from Ireland to English jails, English and Welsh jails. The following year, Eamon de Valera returned home to a hero's welcome and shortly afterwards won a parliament seat in East Clare and also became president of Sinn Féin. In 1920, de Valera toured America and raised millions of dollars from Irish Americans. Such funds came from all over America and Canada, and indeed Britain as well, especially Liverpool, from people whose grandparents had been forced out of Ireland during the famine. Britain had actually unknowingly created a kind of global movement it now found impossible to control. Eventually, a peace treaty was signed with Britain in December 1921. The treaty gave Britain control of Irish ports and elected national representatives. They were obliged to swear allegiance to the British monarchy. So in 1922, the Republican movement split over the terms of the treaty, and basically it was a split between moderates and more radical people. De Valera's on one side, Collins on the other. That basically were both attempting to ensure that the British were forced out of the country, and there was a difference of opinion as to what they should settle for. But de Valera had been born in 1882, just 30 years after the famine, and he was greatly influenced by stories he heard as a young man and as a child. So thousands of other young men and women were also influenced to join the Irish Volunteers in 1913. This led to the 1916 Rising and the demand for complete Irish independence. These events also had a huge impact on the United Kingdom in that they were already under huge pressure to hold their empire together. Australia, for instance, had formed their own federation of colonies in 1901. The Statute of Westminster in 1931, just a decade after Irish independence, granted several other colonies the right to self-rule. In the aftermath of the Second World War, India achieved their own independence in 1948, so several of the colonies achieved independence on a gradual basis. However, both America and Ireland achieved independence on the basis of violent revolution, which gave both nations a common bond and history. This was symbolised by John F. Kennedy's visit to Ireland in 1962. Kennedy's people had left Ireland during the famine, so the visit was a reminder of the turbulent history of the nation and also what it had experienced during the famine, and it was a great inspirational moment for the people of Ireland. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. It's free to do so. Thank you for watching.